So if like-minded countries can come together and pool in their resources for the Pacific Island states, then the Chinese BRI will face a competition. Right now, the Chinese BRI is opaque in its lending terms, and that leads to indebtedness, which you've seen in a number of countries around the world, especially a prime example is Sri Lanka, for instance, and in Pakistan, in our vicinity. But we would not like the same to happen to the Pacific Island states because it creates security issues.
Hello and welcome to the Gist on Strat News Global. Good evening, I'm Surya Gangadharan. Welcome to another edition of the Gist. Prime Minister Modi's visit to Australia appears to have gone down well. He says ties have entered the T20 moment. Now let's go to my guest, Ambassador Anil Wadhwa. He was our envoy to Thailand and Italy, and he's also authored an Indo-Australian economic strategy report. So for right now, what is your sense of how these relations have gone forward after this visit?
So I think we'll have to go back a little bit in terms of the time frame because we've had since 2014 some very high level and extremely important visits on both sides. And during the pandemic in 2020, in fact, we signed a comprehensive strategic partnership with Australia. Following that, there was a very important logistics supply agreement in the naval field, and subsequently some couple of important agreements in the defense research and defense cooperation with Australia. Besides that, as you rightly mentioned, economically the ties have strengthened extremely well because we've had not a comprehensive economic partnership agreement, but what is called an ECTA, an economic cooperation agreement, which covered almost 97% of our exports into Australia. And from the Australian side, almost 87% of their exports into India, bringing tariffs down to zero. And going forward over the next few years, in fact, in the case of Australia, because of wines, it's going to take over 10 years. A number of other exports are going to then attract only 0% duty. So the results have been quite momentous, and it's been very encouraging for both sides. Right now, the two sides are working on a comprehensive economic partnership agreement. And that is what Prime Minister Modi referred to when he said we've entered the T20 format right now, giving an analogy of the strong cricket ties between India and Australia.
Sir, I'd like to take a quick look at some of the key takeaways from the Modi visit to Australia this time. So there's agreement to open consulates in Brisbane and Bengaluru, a joint green hydrogen task force, agreement on migration and mobility partnership, and Australia to open a center on relations with India. What's your quick take on these four takeaways from the visit?
I think these were, barring the first one, the other three were very much in the works for some time now, because we've been talking about a migration and mobility agreement for quite some time. It's a big demand from the Indian side in particular, given the fact that Australia lacks certain skills. And while the number of immigrants into Australia has been hiked by the current Australian government to 195,000 a year from just about 35,000 per year, the movement of professionals and others with certain skills also requires a framework. And this is then going to feed into the comprehensive economic partnership agreement that the two countries are going to sign. But at the same time, India would not like unregulated migration into Australia, because there are rights of those who migrate to other countries which have to be safeguarded. And therefore, with a number of countries, especially the European countries right now, India is insisting on signing a mobility and migration agreement, which is going to help both sides, a win-win for both sides. The green hydrogen partnership has been in the works for some time. In fact, from the time that that Prime Minister Albanese was in India in March, the two sides have been talking quite seriously about setting up this clean hydrogen partnership and entering into joint collaboration for the future. And India is supposed to be a place of investments for Australian companies in this particular field, because this is one area of future collaboration. Thirdly, the issue of opening consulates, and of course, as far as Australia is concerned, Bengaluru is a natural choice. But as far as India is concerned, I think this was one of the recommendations which was there in my Australia Economic Strategy report, which was released by Commerce Minister Piyush Goyal. And along with Brisbane, I have also recommended an opening of a consulate in Adelaide. Perhaps that will be considered at a later stage when there's enough manpower to spare for that particular consulate. So all in all, I think these are all recommendations which were there in the works for some time. They were being talked about for a while as well.
Okay, I'd like to go down to that report you had chaired, sir, 2 years ago. Some of the recommendations there were 12 sectors to be identified, ranging from mining and services to pharma and automobiles. You also highlighted opportunities in 9 other sectors, ranging from defense and space to shipbuilding and water management, cooperation in critical minerals and rare earths, skilling Indian youth, and renewable energy projects where Australia can invest. These have these gone forward in any way?
Yeah, so in fact, it's 12 sectors where we were well established in terms of our exchanges, and 8 sectors which we thought were the futuristic sectors. All in all, 20 sectors were identified. Now, in all these sectors, we've gone forward quite rapidly, and I would say that the ECTA has actually built upon many of those recommendations which are there in the Australia Economic Strategy report. The recommendations section is there at the back of this report, which anybody can see at one glance, and it will be clear from that what has been recommended has many of those recommendations have now been adapted. So, in terms of commodities, in terms of collaboration in fintech, in terms of liberalization of tariffs for our exports to Australia of textiles, labor-intensive industries like gems and jewelry, etc. All those have happened already. And in terms of the new sectors, we have recommended setting up of a startup fund, for instance, which I hope the government will take into account very soon. Although even without that fund, I think the collaboration in the startup sector between India and Australia has proceeded quite well. In fact, there are startup bridges that have been set up between India and Australia, and there is deep cooperation now between the two sides in this area. Things like clinical trials, for instance, has moved forward. India has, in fact, now doing 10 times more clinical trials than India was a few years ago. And this was exactly pointed out in the report that India will become a hub for clinical trials from around the world. And the country with the most amount of affinity for this purpose would be Australia, because Australia has certain kinds of cancers, for instance, which require trials on a diverse kind of population, such as in India. Thirdly, is the issue of services. And I'm glad to say that many of these sectors that have been identified, like perimeter security, etc., they all require mutual recognition agreements. And over the past few months, India and Australia have worked on these mutual recognition agreements. The most important one is in the education sector, which has already gone into force, where we find that there's been mutual recognition of degrees in certain sectors, not all, but certain sectors that both sides have now recognized. So going forward, this will help in setting up new campuses of Australia in India. It will also help in terms of skilling ability to be set up in India. And it will also help Indians to do dual degree programs, for example, in India and Australia, which will bring down their costs. So these are just a few examples. but the most important and significant ones which have happened are in the space and defense side. Space and defense were also identified as the new areas of cooperation in this report. And in space, India and Australia have moved pretty fast in terms of operationalization, in terms of bringing their companies together to enter into joint production and supplies with each other. And in terms of shipbuilding, we've got to do a little more because there's idle capacity in Indian shipyards, which we would like Australia to exploit, especially given the program of Australia going forward in terms of its frigates and, of course, the submarine program, which will happen under AUKUS.
So I just like to focus on the space thing that you mentioned. Does Australia have a space program of any, size? I mean, how does it compare, say, with India's?
So, around the time that the Australia Economic Strategy report was written in 2019, I met the Australian Space Agency, which was newly set up in Adelaide at that point in time. And we already could identify a number of areas where both sides could work together. Of course, the Australian Space Agency works very closely with countries which are strategic allies of Australia, like the United States, for instance. And at the same time, if Australian space program has to take off successfully, they require cost-effective collaborations. And India is one country which can offer this to Australia in terms of components, in terms of launching of satellites, in terms of satellite tracking. All these are areas where India is an ideal partner for Australia. Similarly, in terms of niche areas and in terms of tracking of satellites, Australian sites like the Coco Islands give India access to that part of the world which can be exploited quite easily in a friendly country, in friendly territory, for tracking of some essential satellites. So therefore, there's a win-win on both sides in this collaboration. And I think India can also do a lot of launches for Australia, which they have already identified.
Hmm. Do you see much of defense and security during this visit?
So I don't think the nitty-gritty of the defense and security could have been discussed during this short visit, which has happened now. But we've signed two very important agreements in the past between India and Australia. And the defense research organizations of the two countries have also signed an MOU for identification and working closely together in collaboration and research on some new programs. Some very important areas where India would benefit from collaboration with Australia, for instance, are over the horizon technologies and missile in telemetry, which is important in terms of the futuristic naval warfare. Also, in terms of security of underground cabling, for instance, where quantum technologies and AI would be very useful in tracking any kinds of eavesdropping, and also in terms of making sure that there is a blockage of anyone who is trying to listen in from any part of the world. So these are new technologies which will become important in terms of the Indo-Pacific, particularly for the Pacific as far as Australia is concerned, and for the Southern Indian Ocean as far as India is concerned.
The fact that Australia is a member of AUKUS, does that contribute in any way towards the bilateral sphere?
No, because India has not commented directly on the AUKUS. If you recall, our Foreign Secretary Harsh Singla, when AUKUS did happen, said that this is a security treaty between the three countries, and India has no comments to make on that, which means quite substantially that India has no objection to it either. Given the current situation which prevails in the Indo-Pacific, any effort which is made to make sure that the security of the Indo-Pacific is preserved and a balance is maintained would be good for all the countries who would like freedom of navigation and a peaceful peaceful order in the Indo-Pacific. And AUKUS sort of fits into that kind of overall perspective. When I was talking about AUKUS, I said that in the beginning, countries like Indonesia and Malaysia had criticized AUKUS, saying it would lead to a nuclear arms race in the Indo-Pacific, and that the overall security of the countries in the Indo-Pacific would be adversely affected. However, since then, this criticism has become muted, and in fact, now it is seen more as a balancing force in terms of the growing Chinese presence and aggressiveness in the region. So I think there is much more acceptability of AUKUS. And in terms of the perspective that India has also on AUKUS is more or less the same, that whatever adds up to the balance of security in the region, it would be in the interests of all sides to maintain this balance so that there is preservation of rule of law and freedom of navigation, which continues in the Indo-Pacific.
Do you see some kind of collaboration in the Pacific Islands? PM was just there. There was an agreement to do a lot of things in the Pacific. Although Australia is the primary stakeholder here, do you see some kind of collaboration?
Absolutely, I think it's a very important, train of thought which must be pursued further. You see, India gives about $200 million as grant to all the 14 Pacific Island states, which is on an annual basis, on a rollover basis. And similarly, Australia and New Zealand and Japan and United States, they all have an aid program for the Pacific. Many of these projects that are being undertaken today in the Pacific are of a strategic nature. They are no longer programs which are meant for SMEs or for small business development or for development of hospitals or of the smaller nature which used to happen in the past. And now we are looking at undersea cabling, for instance. We are looking at building ports and jetties in the Pacific Island states, which requires big capital. So, if like minded countries can come together and pool in their resources for the Pacific Island states, then the Chinese BRI will face a competition. Right now, the Chinese BRI is opaque in its lending terms, and that leads to indebtedness, which you've seen in a number of countries around the world, especially a prime example is Sri Lanka, for instance, and in Pakistan in our vicinity. But we would not like the same to happen to the Pacific Island states because it creates security issues. And therefore, all efforts should be made to pool in these resources. India should work with Australia, Japan, United States in the Quad context, and also with countries like New Zealand, which are predominant in the region.
So, last question, sir. Looking back on the PM's visit and your own report, where do you see the forward movement now?
I think it's important to take the movement forward in terms of a comprehensive economic partnership, which seals our bilateral relationship in terms of investments, A, and B, in terms of liberalization of services and movement of personnel between the two countries. Now, I've always said that India and Australia relationship in the economic side is an investment driven relationship. It is investments which actually drive trade between the two countries. The more we invest in each other, the better the trade will become. Because after all, there is a limited market for 25 million people in Australia. But there is a huge market for the Australian side in terms of commodities in India. And India would like to see Australian companies invest in the commodity market in India to develop that, to come into the mining sector, especially to invest in the new age commodities like lithium, for instance, which will feed into the battery sector, the e-mobility program that India has, and it's going to become more and more ambitious as we go forward. It's another matter now that as we go forward, we will have new technologies, and we will have probably more resources to invest in them in India itself. But Australia is a major partner as we see it right now. The second area that I would like to see Australia engage India much more is in terms of startups and in terms of niche technologies like medical devices, for instance, which can only have a market in India, which does not have a market in Australia.
So you're looking at more Australian investment in India.
Absolutely, absolutely. And of course, I'm not ruling out Indian investments in Australia. Indian investments in Australia will probably be much more in the commodity sector than in any other sector. And that's only natural.
So looking forward, when do you expect this comprehensive economic partnership to be finalized? This year itself, or it could take longer?
Talking about talking about completion of these negotiations by the end of this year. So we hope that by November or December this year, we will be able to also sign this agreement.
Any challenges you see, sir, in realizing this? Political opposition there, perhaps?
I don't think there is a political opposition on either side to complete this agreement. In fact, both governments are very supportive of this agreement. What the challenges that I can see coming are from the various lobbies that exist on both sides. On the Indian side, there are certain sectors which are no go, for instance, the dairy sector. And on the Australian side, for instance, it's certain services where Australia would not like cheap Indian labor, for example, to flood the market and take over the high cost skills that Australia offers in those sectors. And I'm talking more in terms of the sophisticated sectors like the banking sector, for instance, where India will only add to those sectors, not actually detract from Australia in any way there.
Ambassador Wadhwa, thank you for that perspective. And let's see where Indo-Australian ties go forward in the coming year. Thank you very much, sir. Glad to have you.
Thank you very much.
And for those of you who joined us on this conversation, do subscribe to our YouTube channel and do follow us on social media and Twitter. Thank you very much. Good night.